Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. Thank you for coming. Today, I'm going to talk about your app, the identity provider, and everything in between, which means, in short, how to authenticate your users in your Python app. So before we start, let's talk a little bit about myself. So this is my picture, as you understand. I love technology. I'm also a backend developer, and I'm mostly interested in the security aspects of the backend development. And I recently joined Microsoft as a software engineer. Now, this is connected to the next story that I'm going to tell you, which is before I joined Microsoft, I worked at Nokia. And I owned their backend application. We developed in Python. And that's not how it looks, but that's an illustration. And when I started to develop this app, I thought that, we have users and we need to handle them. And then I realized that I need to think about a way to authenticate my users. So I started to Google a lot, and that's how my browser looks like. Lots of Googling, and it took time. Now, after I Googled a lot, I realized two kinds of articles or YouTube videos. The first part was theory, videos that were mostly theoretical and talked about the authentication flows. And the second kind was mostly practice, which was just a code. And it was great, but it makes the learning time, it increased the learning time because I need to move from this kind of article to the second time of articles. And in the end, when I started to understand how it works, I decided to share with the world both of them, both theory and practice. I hope that I will be able to share it with you in these 20 minutes. Okay. So first, let's ask when we meet the identity provider. So I want to introduce you two scenarios. The first one is when we are logging into Twitter, and we have two ways. We have this nice login page first, and we have two ways of login. The first one is to fill in our username and password and click on the login button. And the second one is to click on the login with Google. So personally, I will prefer to click on the login with Google. Why? Because one, this is just one click, and two, because I don't need to remember a password for each website. I just need to remember the Google password, and my memory is still is full enough, so I prefer to remember just the Google password. Okay, the second scenario. So I want to edit a PDF file, and this PDF file is located in my Google Drive, and I have an online PDF editor. So how should I move this file to the online PDF editor? So I guess that the answer to this question will be no. And the second way is more manual one. We can maybe download the file manually from the Google Drive and then upload it also manually to the PDF editor, which is, I guess, takes time. So there is a magic option which looks like this. We have a nice window opened which asks us, okay, the PDF editor wants to edit your Google Drive files, and we have just to click on the Allow button. And now, these scenarios just showed us in a day-to-day examples what are the main responsibilities of the identity provider. So the first scenario shows us that the identity provider can enable the app to log in its user through a third-party identity provider, which is Google account in this case. And in the second scenario, we see that the user gives the app permissions to access the user resources, and the identity provider is responsible for giving these permissions. Now let's, in order to implement these scenarios in your app, you need to use these two friends protocols, which called auth2 and OpenID Connect. And the goal of the auth2 is to enable your app to access the user resources, which is the second scenario. And the goal of the OpenID Connect is to let the app log in its users through Google, for example. The OpenID Connect is a protocol that relies on the auth2, by the way, and you will see it soon. Okay, Now let's see how the flow is working. In this session, I will show you it with Microsoft Azure because that's how I implemented it at Nokia. Let's start. So everything here starts and ends with a token. So let's see how we get this token first. So we are talking now about the OAuth code flow. And this flow starts when the user goes to the app homepage. So the app redirects the user from the home page to the Microsoft login page. Microsoft show the user a login form. The user enter his username and password and click on the submit. Microsoft validates that the password is correct. And after that came the dramatic part, which is Microsoft sends a code back to the app callback endpoint. How Microsoft sends this? So the app has a callback endpoint, which you will see soon. And Microsoft sends an HTTP request to this endpoint and put the code as an argument. Now, after the app gets the code from the argument, the app exchanges code with tokens. Now, there are 3 types of tokens in this combination of flow. The first one is the ID token, which is part of the OpenID protocol, and it's used for retrieving the information about the user. The second one is the access token, which is used for the app in order to access the user resources, for example, to do a OneDrive file. And this is part of the OAuth 2 protocol. And the refresh token, which is an interesting one, it's used for requesting new tokens once the user, once the ID tokens and the access token are expired, because they are not living forever, and we don't want to log in the user again and again. Now let's implement it in a Flask app. So first one, we need to register our app in the identity provider portal. So in my case, I used Microsoft as an identity provider. So you can see here examples of screenshots which I used in order to register my app. In the first screenshot, I just generated a secret. And in the second screenshot, I grant my app permissions to access on behalf of the user. And of course, there are lots and lots of screenshots, but this is documented enough. So I will give links in the end. So after we register our app in the identity provider, we fill in the conf file. So in this case, I used a class because I want to simplify that for this code. So the first important conf is the client ID, which is the ID of the app in the identity provider system. We also put a secret, which is a super secret string used by the app in order to get the tokens in the end. And we also put the OAuth URI, which is actually the URL of the login page of Microsoft, and the app will redirect the user to. This is the redirect URI, which is the callback endpoint that we talked about before. And the token URI, which is the URL that's used in order to request the tokens. Great. Now let's prepare the home endpoint. So first of all, we prepare the auth parameters, and we will redirect the user with these parameters. So the first parameter we use is the client ID, and we also attach the redirect URI because we want to tell Microsoft to which URL to redirect the code to. The third parameter is the response type. We mentioned that we want to get the code as in the request in the callback endpoint. And we also mentioned that we want the access type to be offline because we want to get the refresh token and not to log in the user again and again. Now, this is an important part, the scope. And the scope is the things that we want to access in the end. So when we want to use the OpenID protocol on the OAuth 2 protocol, we mentioned that in the scope, we request the OpenID scope. And if we want to get the details of the user, we also mentioned the claims that we want to be in the ID token, which are the profile and the email. We also request an offline access scope because we want the refresh token, and we request the file.read.all because we want to read the user OneDrive files. Now we prepare the redirect URL, which is the OAuth URI plus the parameters that we just prepared, and we redirect the user to that URL. So nice. The user came to the homepage and redirected to the Microsoft login. Okay. Now it fills in the login form. Microsoft validates the login form. And now Microsoft sends the code to the app callback endpoint. Let's see how it looks. So this is the callback endpoint. So first we get the code from the arguments. And then we request the token. We use the access code in order to request the token. You will see the request token function in the next slide. We store the tokens in the session, and also we store the expiration date time because we want to know when to refresh. And we return to the user that he successfully logged in. Let's see how we exchange the code with the tokens. So we prepare the parameters, which are the code, because that's what we want to exchange. We also put the client ID and the client secret, and the redirect URI, and also the grant type, which is, I think, important here, because that's our way to tell Microsoft that we want to exchange the token by code and not by something else. So we send this post request to the token URI, which with these parameters in the body, and we get the token as a request. So now we can use them. So the first use of the tokens is to get the user details. So here in this case, we want to get the Microsoft user profile. So before we start to talk about this, a few words about the JWT structure, which is called also JOT. This is a standard of token structure, and this is actually JSON Web Token. And it contains 3 parts. The first one is the header, which is the token metadata. The second one is the payload, which is the data itself. So for example, if we are using here the ID token, the user profile details will be in the payload. And also the signature, which is the part in the token that used in order to validate that the token was not modified in the middle. Now, I want just to show you a quick example. So this is a JOT token. You can see that it contains 3 parts separated by dots. And the middle part, which colored with blue, this is the payload, and this contains actually the data. So let's decode it in base64, and we will get this nice object, which each field of this object called claim. And you can see that it's really useful claims. For example, when the token was issued, when it's supposed to be expired, and etc. Now let's get the user details from the ID token in the code. So first we split the token by the dots because we want to get the middle part. We get the payload section and turn it into Bates array and decode it in base64. And that's great because now we get the user details from the ID token. Now, just a comment here. So tokens needs to be validated in the API that they are intended for. So in this example, the ID token was supposed to be validated, but because we get it directly from the identity provider, we'll skip the validation. We got it over HTTPS, and this is considered enough secure by the standard. Now let's access a resource. So we want to access a OneDrive file. Now we'll use the access token and not the ID token because this is the part of the OS2. We will send a GET request to the Microsoft Graph API, which is the OneDrive API. And the different part here is that we add in the header a header called authorization, and its value is equal to bearer and space and the access token that we just got. So as a response, we got the information that we just requested. Okay. Now what happens if the token is expired? So we request a refresh token. So we send a post request to the token URIs again. But here, instead of code in the grant type, we put the refresh token in the grant type. We also send the client ID and the client secret and an important field called the refresh token, which is the actual refresh token that we want to exchange. And as a response, we got, again, 3 tokens as before. Okay, this is great. But what happens if my front-end and backend are separated services, which happened a lot. So the access code is not shared. In order to solve this issue, there is a protocol called on behalf of flow, and it's almost the same as before, except few minor changes. And before I start talking about this in a few words, I just must mention that this is not the only way of doing that. There are other flow, for example, from Google called the server-side flow, but that's what I use personally because Microsoft was my identity provider. And when we want to implement this flow, we need to register 2 client applications. The first one is the front-end application, and we give it the permissions of the backend API. And the second one is the backend API application, and we give the permissions of the OpenID and the read files, which are the main permissions, I would say, because the logic is done in the backend. Now, the frontend requests the tokens as before, exactly, but instead of putting the OpenID in the scope, so it puts the backend API scope. And it's continues here when the frontend sends a request to the backend, and the backend take the frontend token and exchange it with a new one. So there are 2 tokens request here, one in the frontend side and the second in the backend side. And after that, the backend gets his newly generated token and requests the user resource on behalf of the user, but with the newly generated backend token. So the most, I think, main difference here are the scopes. So in the OAuth code flow, the scopes that were requested are the OpenID and the resource access scope. And in the OBO flow, the scopes that were requested from the front-end side were the backend API scope. And in the backend call, the scopes were the OpenID and the resource. Now, let's see the code of the backend exchanging the front-end token with the new backend token. So again, it sends a request to the token URI, and in the data, it puts the grant type, which now JWT bearer. And also it puts in the client ID and the client secret. And also a new field for us, which is the assertion, and it contains the front-end access token. And in the scopes, this is the scope that now requested, which is, for example, file.read. And this is also a new field called on behalf of flow. Now, before we finish, I just want to make 2 points. So there are lots of client-specific Python libraries. For example, after I understand this topic, I used MSIL for the Microsoft Identity Provider, and you can also have the Google Auth library. And you also have the generic libraries like auth or auth and PyJWT, and which highly recommended. These are more resources, which I personally used. The last one I highly recommend because this is a playground which you can simulate the flows by yourself. And time for Q&A.
Can you expand a bit about the difference between the access token and the refresh token?
Okay. So the access token is a token that's used for requesting the user resource. So once I have the access token, I can, for example, request the user files. But the refresh token is a token that's used like the access code we talked about in the beginning. By having the refresh token, we can request a new access and ID token. Okay.
Do you have like tips about how to QA something goes wrong with the whole process? Like instead of debug it or create the problem?
Okay, so I think this is changed between the identity provider you choose. I think that there are identity providers that supplies you lots of logs, which is great. And there are identity providers that not. Personally, I tried at home, also Google Identity Provider, and the logs were great. And debugging, the agnostic debugging, I guess that it would be like Postman and getting the status codes or things like that. But mostly the error, if you use famous identity provider, the errors are the error logs are quite understood. So thank you all.